Hi, it's Stephen Seiler here. On the 18th of July, I'm really looking forward to presenting my 3-hour live stream hosted by the Physical Performance Show, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. Get your tickets today, and I will see you online.
We are thrilled to be hosting acclaimed sports scientist Dr. Stephen Seiler, forefather of polarized training, on an upcoming 3-hour live stream event in July. Dr. Seiler, during this live stream, will cover 4 key areas around sustainable training for attainable endurance goals: intensity distribution for long-term performance development, interval training, periodization and peaking, training monitoring to support the process, and Q&A time. To register for this live stream, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler, and from just $49, you can learn from one of the world's most preeminent sports scientists around all things endurance training. The ticketed price includes post-live stream recording, a workbook, and of course, live Q&A time with Dr. Seiler himself.
This is Joe Friel. I'm a coach, one of the co-founders of Churning Peaks, and author of some books like this, the Triathletes Training Bible. I appreciate your listening to me on the Physical Performance Show today, and all the best of luck for your upcoming churning and racing.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go.
So all the workout does is give you the potential for fitness. The workout doesn't give you fitness. It only creates potential for fitness. The potential is realized during sleep.
That was the voice of Joe Friel, this week's Expert Edition, coach of coaches, prolific author on all things endurance sports and triathlon, and co-founder of Training Peaks. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Kinesis Sunscreens and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes: interest editions, expert editions, featured performers, and coaches' corners. And on today's episode, we catch up with Joe Friel. Joe Friel is the best-selling author of 17, soon to be 18 books: the Cyclist Training Bible, Triathlon Science, the Triathletes Training Bible, Fast After 50, the Power Meter Handbook, and so many more titles. And during today's conversation, we go back to Joe discovering triathlon in its infancy in 1983. Joe shares why he didn't think the sport of triathlon would make it, why it seemed too good to be true. We touch on Joe trialing one of the very first bike power meters, the founding of Training Peaks in 1999, the growth of triathlon coaching in the sport over the last several decades, and we look at key physical performance endurance training principles, including some of the most well-known and loved features of Training Peaks, including fatigue, fitness, form, and the interpretation of training stress score. Joe shares on the top 3 mistakes that endurance athletes make, the challenges coaches face, top masters athlete advice, and how to be race prepared and ready. Get ready with a pen and paper for this expert edition. Here is my conversation with Joe Friel. Joe Friel, co-founder of Training Peaks, and I think you very well may be my new endurance study/working hero. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Oh, hi, Brad. Thanks very much. I appreciate your comments.
Joe, in pulling this together today, I've spent some time going back through your background, and while we really want to pull out some of your great learnings, you've got so much to offer the endurance sporting community. I think it would be doing your career a disservice not to touch on some of the key milestones along the way. Joe, you did a double major in exercise science and history, but you weren't having a good time, and there was a bit of serendipity that resulted in you opening a running shoe store. So can you take us back to that moment before we go forwards?
I'd been teaching by that point for, I think, about 7 or 8 years, high school, while I was coaching also as track and field coach. And while I enjoyed working with the kids and I enjoyed track and field especially, I didn't like the environment of being in the school. Bell rings and you go do something every 55 minutes. And it was something I wasn't really enjoying all that much. And so basically I decided I was going to open a running store. And this is at a time when there were probably only, 3 or 4 or 5 running stores in the whole United States. This is 1980. Back in those days, if you wanted to buy running equipment, shoes, for example, you went to a general sporting goods store, and somebody who was a basketball player knew the price of the shoes and what color they were, and that's about all they could help you with. So you had to try things on and just figure it out for yourself. So there were a few of us who were deciding that it was time to have a store just for runners. And so I opened my store 1980, and it went well at first. It was a hell of a learning experience. Going from teaching to retail was not easy by any means. I thought it was going to be just like you sell the shoes at retail and you buy them at wholesale and you put the difference in your pocket. And it wasn't quite that easy, I found out. It was everybody had their hand out wanting money from me all the time. So consequently, it was very challenging. I did it for 7 years, and during that 7 years, my coaching began to take off. And I realized about 1987 that I really enjoyed coaching a lot more than retail. And so I made the switch, and here I am.
And I recall hearing, Joe, that you'd calculated that you needed around 70-odd athletes to be able to make the coaching career, work in and of itself. And the bit that I really admire and respect from your background, Joe, is you worked another job while you were building up your coaching business, if you like, after hours and across weekends. This wasn't an immediate switch full-time to full-time, was it?
No, it wasn't. It was a real difficult time in my life. It starts in 1987 and lasted about 5 or 6 years. In order to pay the bills at what I was charging in those days, I had to have 72 clients, I realized. And so in the meantime, I had to have some other source of income. So I actually had 2 other jobs. I worked for a nonprofit agency as a fundraiser in the community I lived in. It was a children's program, kids program. And my job was to raise money to keep the program going. I did that for about 5 years. And at the same time, I was also editing a triathlon newsletter, magazine, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't quite the glossy look that we have now. And so I was the editor of that. That was done after hours from my day job. And then I was coaching besides that, which was till 11 o'clock or midnight every night, and on the whole weekend doing that also. And so I was a pretty busy boy there for a while. And finally in 1987 or 1992, I achieved my goal of 72 clients, and decided to quit my other 2 jobs and just go into coaching full time. And that, while it made my life a lot easier in terms of my time available, it made finance a lot more difficult because it wasn't really a whole heck of a lot of money coming in. And so for the next few years, I was still struggling with that. And so it's a long, long story, but anyway, it's all brought me to where I am now. And I wouldn't change anything. It's been a hell of a voyage.
And that's I think the bit that I really respect and admire as well there, Joe, is that nothing happened quickly. It took 5 years from 1987, where you started coaching, to 1992, where you became a full-time coach. And then 7 years later, which we'll touch on in a moment, the founding of Training Peaks. Joe, we left out the triathlon beginnings for you. In 1993, I believe you took up 1983, my correction, you took up triathlon, and this was really the beginning days, both in the US and Australia, wasn't it? So what's your first recollection of your very first triathlon?
Oh, yeah, I recall it vividly. In fact, I've still got a T-shirt someplace in one of my drawers from that race, 1983. It was an Olympic distance race. that was in a community not too far from where I lived in Colorado. So I had no idea what to expect. I did it because one of my employees at that time in my running store, one of my employees was a triathlete, and he was telling me how great the sport was. And so finally I decided I'll just give it a try. And so I signed up for the race, and I had a hell of a good time. I really enjoyed it, and came back and decided this is really what I want to do. I enjoy this more than running, which I've been doing for many years. And I like the variety. I just liked everything about the sport, the enthusiasm that all the athletes had. And I could tell it was a great sport to be involved in. So I took the big plunge and decided to become a triathlete back in 1983.
1983. And I imagine at that moment, putting on, I don't know, did you wear a wetsuit in your first swim, Joe, or was it too warm for that?
That first race was a pool swim.
There you go.
So 1,500 meters in a pool, and then so forth. But it was an interesting day.
How many competitors were there in that first Colorado 1983 race?
I can't tell you the exact number, but more than likely, 50 or 60 athletes would be my guess. It would be very difficult to run a 1,500-meter pool swim with a large audience of athletes involved. Wow. So I'm sure I don't recall the numbers, but I recall the transition area was quite tiny. There were just, not very, just a few handfuls of bikes there.
I think who could have imagined what your future would look like? 40 years of coaching later, co-founding, one of the training tools, Training Peaks, that really... there's not too many endurance athletes on the planet that haven't heard of it or used Training Peaks, or coaches that, use it as their main coaching tool. I mean, could you have imagined at that stage? I'm sure you couldn't.
No, that was absolutely, I didn't think the sport of triathlon was ever really going to make it. I always kept thinking, well, it's going to last a couple more years and that'll be the end of it. It's too good to be true, and it's too difficult to close roads for the bike and run and so forth. And swim venues are not easy to come by, et cetera. So I just realized someday the sport's it's just going to close up. And so I was going to get all the fun out of it I could while I could. And so lo and behold, by the 90s, it was still around and going gangbusters by the mid-90s, which really surprised the heck out of me. And so we obviously kept on doing it. Sport just kept on growing. I was quite honestly amazed at how fast it grew back in the 90s especially.
What do you think was fueling that? I started in 1990, 1991 in Australia as a 10 or 11-year-old. What do you think fueled that growth over there in the US in the 90s? You had some big names, the Mark Allens, the Dave Scotts, the Paula Newby Frasers. What was driving it?
Yeah, I don't think it was those folks really that were driving it. They certainly contributed to the success of the sport, no question about that. The first one was Ironman. I think had a big impact on it. It came on television in the early '80s, and that had a big impact on enthusiasm for the sport. In fact, back in those days, back in the '80s and '90s, if you asked anybody why they were doing triathlon, they almost always told you because they saw it on television. That got their attention and got them excited about the sport when they were talking about, of course, the Ironman. And so that was really the impetus that got it going. But what really back in the 80s, what kept it popular in the 80s, especially in the U.S., was something called the U.S. Triathlon Series. It was a series of races that began about 1985 or 6, something like that, and lasted for almost a decade. And they were the first ones to start using what we now consider the Olympic distance or the standard distance triathlon. They were the first ones to do that. And that became really a huge driving factor in the U.S. They had races all over the U.S. They had prize money for masters, which at that time I was a masters athlete. So I was traveling around the country going to races where I could win a couple $100. Not a big deal, but there's something about it when you're 40-something years old to be able to make a couple $100 was a real big deal. So that drove the sport. That got people started. They were enticed by seeing Ironman on TV, but having the U.S. Triathlon Series available with races that were all around the country that were well marketed. They had great turnouts for the races. There were hundreds and hundreds of athletes at the races. They had great venues all over the country, Chicago, New York, et cetera. And so that really drew a lot of people into the sport. That took us into the 90s, and then the sport just began to really take off extremely well in the 90s.
And then one of the attractive features is you could toe the start line with the pros, right? Like you could be an age group athlete racing the same course, and it's one of those rare sports where you can do that. And I think people have always really appreciated that. I mean, obviously there's the World Triathlon Series for the standard distance or Olympic distance racing these days where age groupers can't race in the same race but on the same weekend perhaps. But that's always been a real charm of triathlon, hasn't it, Joe?
It has, yeah. In fact, that kind of came from running. In the U.S., running was a real big deal back in the 70s. And that was one of the beauties that the runners always talked about, was the fact that you were on the starting line with, Bill Rogers and Frank Shorter and all the big runners at the time in the U.S. For all the major races. And so consequently, that boiled over into triathlon because a lot of runners, that's where where the most of the initial triathlon. And so that was the same enthusiasm of being on the starting line with the best in the world at every race you go to. There were just a lot of things about the sport and still are about the sport that really attracted a lot of people to it.
Yeah, what the simple pleasures. Joe, before we jump into the world of Training Peaks and your top teachings for endurance athletes and coaches, one thing that really jumped out from your history is, and it seems kind of uncanny we'd be talking about this given the current climate as we record this with the worldwide pandemic, but you contracted a heart condition. You thought it might have been a virus from a bird from the best of your knowledge in the snowy mountains when you were out in Australia contesting I believe the World Duathlon Championships in Adelaide, and that resulted in you needing to take some time away from training, which resulted in your first book, the Cyclist Bible, which became a bestseller and started a career of authoring, a total of 17 books. So that's that's quite a story, Joe. We reckon it's those birds in the snowy mountains, eh?
Yeah, I think that's where it came from. You're right. My wife and I had been down there for the race. And after the race, we decided to stick around for another week and just enjoy ourselves. And so consequently, we were out in the Blue Mountains, and there was a really unique housing out there for, I don't know what you would call it. It wasn't really a hotel. There were tree houses, and you could rent a tree house as you would a hotel room for a week or whatever you wanted. So we had a tree house that we were staying in for the week. And I discovered that there were these birds, very colorful birds, that if you put bread in your hand, they would land on your hand and eat the bread out of your hand. And I thought that was really cool. So every morning I was getting up for a week and feeding birds out of my hand. And I happened to catch a cold while I was there. In fact, the cold I'd had for several days, even before we arrived where the birds were. I had this cold. This was like, I believe, must have been around midwinter, sometime January or so. And so we go back to the States, and lo and behold, the cold doesn't go away. And by March, there was a half marathon I would do every year. I ran the half marathon, wearing a heart rate monitor, very hilly course. It's a very, very challenging race. And I noticed throughout the race that my heart rate was extremely high. I'd never seen numbers like that at all for the pace I was running. And but of course, being a runner, I kept on going regardless. When I got all done, I talked to my wife about it, and she suggested I see the doctor, see what was going on. Something wasn't quite right. So I saw my doctor. He didn't find anything. Ran a few tests. So I started doing research myself. Went to the library and spent a lot of time going through various medical journals, looking for symptoms like mine, which was by this point becoming like tightness in my chest and a cough and sore throat and so forth. It was in my lungs. It just was really nasty. And so now I've been going on for something like 3 months, not going away, not getting any better. And so I finally came across a research study which talked about a virus that was transmitted by birds that could settle into your lungs or your heart, could cause lots of problems. So I went back to my doctor and asked him if he would run a test for that, and he found antibodies that seemed to confirm that this could very well be the case. So he sent me to a cardiologist And the cardiologist went on to explain that after running his test, what I had was a valve in my heart that wouldn't close all the way. So consequently, my heart had to beat faster to try to get enough blood into the system to fuel the muscles, since so much was being lost because of the leakage. They call it regurgitation within the heart itself. And so his advice was that I shouldn't do any more exercise until the symptoms I had were gone. The biggest being this pressure or tightness in my chest that I would feel from time to time. So I didn't know how long that would be, nor did he, but he just suggested I not do anything at all exercise-wise. So there had been this publishing house that had been after me to write a book. They'd been reading my magazine articles and they wanted me to write a book, and so I kept telling them I didn't have time, but now all of a sudden it looked like I would have time. So I reached out to them and said, hey, I'm ready. I'll write that book now that you keep asking me about. And that became, as you mentioned, the Cyclist Training Bible. Basically what I was trying to do was just write down my ideas on how to train, thinking it might sell 1,000 copies or something. That'd be the end of it. So I wasn't, it was just, for me, it was more like, this is my chance to explain what I do and why I do it. It will make me a better coach. That was the reason why I did it. I didn't do it to sell books. And so the first month the book was out, it sold like 5,000 copies. And they were already into a reprint after a couple of months. And so the book just took off amazingly, became the best-selling book on cycling ever written. And then that spawned other books. And so now I've written, I'm just finishing off my 17th book. And I've got my 18th book in the back of my mind, working on it right now in my head. And these things keep coming down the line. I just enjoy writing. I'm just enjoying being able to learn myself, because that's what it is me. What have I learned? And let me share this with some other folks besides me. And if they want to buy the book, that's all the better. But it's just been a lot of fun for me. I've enjoyed it immensely.
And, anyone listening, you must go and check out Joe's back library there. Triathlon Science, Triathletes Training Bible, Fast After 50, the Power Meter Handbook. There is something for everyone in the world of endurance. And Joe, I think it's neglectful to not mention that for 20 years, you outputted a local newspaper column. And so this is the thing that I see from your life's work. You have been consistent. You mentioned it was tough when you were trying to work 3 jobs to transition to full-time coaching. I think it's encouraging to anyone out there that's pursuing something that's of importance to them to keep on keeping on, right?
Yeah, I never had really any imagination or reflections that it would be something that would turn into a career. It was just something I always enjoyed doing, and I was always curious. I always wondered. I'm always wondering why. Why is that? Why do we do this in training? Could we do it better in a different way? And so that led me to read the research and talk to other coaches and talk to athletes and spend a lot of time just thinking my way through the whole process of training for sport. And so it's always been just a curiosity for me. And that's been the driving force, still is to this day. I still read research to this day, and I'm always taking notes. I'm always thinking my way through some of the topics that I run into or people ask me questions about. So it's been fun.
A lifelong learner, spawned by that curiosity you mentioned. Joe, just before Training Peaks conversation here, we launch over there. In writing the Cyclist Training Bible, one of the really neat stories was you were exposed to really the first power meter for bikes when Greg LeMond was making a comeback, and you were asked to go and check it out and write about it. And I believe you've still got one of the prototype or the very first power meter.
I do, yeah. It's hanging in my garage. It's kind of ugly. Hasn't been used in a couple of decades, but that was the first one I got. That was back in that was. I tried one in 1994, I believe it was 93, 94, right around there. SRM loaned me one to try it before I wrote the Cyclist Training Bible, just so I could find out what it was all about. And so, but I only had it for 3 months, and so I sent it back. In 1998, a guy called me from Boston and said he had read my Cyclist Training Bible. In the end of that book, I'd said that I thought power meters were going to be something that would be valuable in the future, but right now they were just barely in the infant stage. They really hadn't taken off at all, not even close. And so I had said someday these will become much less expensive. More people start using them, and that will change the way we train. And I had like one paragraph at the end of the book. So this guy calls me from Boston and says he's a cyclist and he's a mechanical engineer, and he had just designed a new power meter. Wanted to know if I'd like to see it. And so I said, sure. And at that time I lived in Colorado. So he flew from Boston to Denver, Boulder to see me, brought the wheel out with him. It was a power tap. And so I got to try Power Meter again. He took it for a ride around the block to see how it worked. And then he gave me one, which is the one I have hanging in my garage still, just to play with. So I was, I said like a 5-year absence of having power meters there back in the 90s, and now I was back on power meters again. And now I still use them. I've been using power meters ever since that day that he came to see me in 1998. And I still think they're a fantastic tool.
Amazing. I mean, fast forward now to one of Training Peak's more recent releases, WK05, and the Power has, you've really been a driving force behind implementing that into athletes' training vocabulary, if you like. What a story. Joe, 1999 was the founding of Training Peaks, the app that we all know and love and so many of us use. Your co-founders were involved as well, but you were faxing programs. From what I've heard you describe, it was highly inefficient. It's a big job, and it was your son's suggestion, who just returned from pro cycling, that maybe you should take this online. Is that how it started?
Yeah, pretty much. That's the story. I was, as you said, doing everything by fax, because by this point I had athletes around the world I was coaching. Late 90s. So that was the only way to communicate really easily back in those days. It was a real hassle to deal with. Every Monday morning I would get up, and the athletes had to fax their diary pages back to me. So it'd be 2 pages for each athlete for the week. They'd fax back to me. So every Monday morning when I walked into my office, my desk would be covered with all these rolls of fax paper, and they'd be spilling onto the floor, and I'd have to go through and sort them out, figure out which 2 pages went together for each athlete, and staple them. And it was just a major hassle. So at that time, my son had been racing pro as a road cyclist, late 80s, early 90s, and he joined me as an assistant coach back in the late 90s. And he wasn't too thrilled with the system I was using of faxing stuff to athletes. So he suggested that we do something online. And he just happened to have a friend who was a programmer. And so he went to him and said, could you put this online for us? Basically, it was just the sheet that I was using, the calendar, if you will, the calendar page the athlete would receive their schedule, their workouts on which they would record what they had done. Could we put that online? The guy said, no problem. So he put it online. And he wound up being very proud of it himself, the programmer did. And so he started to take a real interest in it. And my son, of course, had a real interest in it also, because he wanted to get away from using fax paper. And I was kind of amazed at what we were able to do. All of a sudden, we were communicating with athletes around the world in real time and seeing data from them without having to deal with all these horrendous sheets of rolled up paper on my desk in the mornings. And so it took off, and us were the founders. It was my son, his friend's name is Gear Fisher. Gear eventually became our CEO, ran the company for many years. Now he's starting another company for athletes called On Form. It basically is a way of video recording athletes and working on skill development. It's a great tool. So the 3 of us put this together, not thinking it would be anything that would really be a big deal, but it would just be something that my coaches could use. By this time, I had several coaches working for me, and it would be our tool. But that was 1999. We launched it. And then in 2000, the 3 of us realized this thing was really much better than we thought it was, and decided to open it up to anybody that wanted to use it. Yeah. Mostly at first it was athletes who wanted to be able to keep records of their own training. But eventually coaches started using it, and now coaches are our biggest market. And so it took off. It just really was, again, something really quite amazing that none of us ever anticipated happening.
And back in the early days, I think it was only 4 buttons. Is that correct?
Something like that, yeah. There were just like 4 clicks on the entire screen. If you could change from the calendar mode to the setup mode, or whatever it was. I don't recall what they were now. But now there are literally thousands of things that you can click and do on Training Peaks. It's become gigantic. People use it all the time, keep up with all this stuff, especially coaches. But it can be, when you first come into it, it can be kind of overwhelming what all the possibilities are. So you have to kind of start off just using the most basic things and very gradually try out different ways of working, communicating with clients and such. And eventually figure out there's all kinds of things you can do that are really pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely, and constantly evolving. I'm so curious, though, Joe, the name. I was thinking about this last night. I'm like, I must ask Joe, what was behind the name?
It started out being called Churning Bible, because that was just the name we gave it, since my books were called the Churning Bible. And but began to realize that was causing confusion. I've got these books called Churning Bible, and we've got this online tool called Churning Bible. And so people were confused. And the guy who was the programmer, we had T-shirts and shirts made up, of course, that said Churning Bible on them. And he would travel someplace and be in an airport, and somebody would ask him what religion he was associated with, and since he saw the word Bible on his shirt, and he wasn't taken too kindly at that. He thought it was he didn't like the name really all that well. So we decided to change the name, and I really don't recall how the name Churning Peaks came about, but that was suggested, and we finally decided that was what we were going to call it. That was in about 2002 or 3, something like that, I suppose.
You're listening to Joe Friel, Training Peaks founder, triathlon coach of coaches, and prolific endurance sports author, on this, an expert edition of the Physical Performance Show. Support for today's show comes from Kinesis Sunscreen. Kinesis is a range of sports performance sunscreens for your active lifestyle. Everything about Kinesis sunscreen range, from the ergonomic bottle to the ingredients they include and leave out from their formulations, have been developed specifically for athletes. Different to any sunscreen you've tried, and so light you won't feel like you're wearing it. Kinesis sunscreen is super easy to apply, won't affect your grip or sting your eyes. Kinesis can be bought through select retail partners in Canada, the USA and Australia, or online through their regional websites. Search Kinesis Active, that's Kinesys Active. Take advantage also of Kinesis's generous offer of 20% off the entire range of spray and natural zinc sunscreen. Simply use the coupon code POGO, P-O-G-O, over on Kinesis's regional websites. Enjoy staying active while staying sun protected with Kinesis Sunscreen. Support for today's show is also brought to you by Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you're an endurance athlete, triathlete or runner frustrated with not being at your physical best due to a joint, tendon or bone stress injury, our telehealth consultations are effective and efficient in helping you get back to your endurance sports physical best. To find out more about our 45-minute cost-effective telehealth consultations with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with this week's guest on this expert edition, Joe Friel, founder of Training Peaks and prolific endurance sports author. Joe, let's just discuss some of the performance management chart metrics. There's the 3 scores that everyone looks at: the fatigue, the fitness, and the form. What are the best ways, you as one of the co-founders of this, would share with endurance athletes to get the most out of those numbers? And maybe we start with what each of them are.
These all come from the mind of Andy Coggan, the PhD. Andy and a guy by the name of Hunter Allen wrote a book called Training and Racing with the Power Meter, which has really kind of become the Bible, if you will, of power meters. The book I wrote is really an introduction to how to use a power meter. Their book is kind of the Bible of how to use the power meter. It goes into great detail. My book you could probably read before you go to bed at night, just as a way of relaxing. Their book is not quite like that at all. It's more like a textbook. You've got to really be, you're studying everything all the time, looking at numbers and all kinds of challenging thoughts. A great book. If you have a power meter, every athlete that has a power meter ought to have this book in their library so you can look up things, if nothing else. But anyway, the ideas of the chronic churning load, acute churning load, and churning stress balance, those ideas come mostly from Andy Coggan. Hunter contributed those also, and there were other parties that contributed to them too, but they were the primary contributors. The idea was that this goes back to something from the 1970s called TRIMP, T-R-I-M-P, which stands for Churning Impulse. It was a researcher back then, about 1973, I believe it was, came up with the idea that the problem we have with training, endurance training, there are only really two variables that you can look at in a workout. One variable is duration, how long did the workout last? And the other variable is intensity, how hard was it? We never had any way of putting those two numbers into one number. It was always, these things were talked about individually. And so athletes, especially runners and cyclists, and most all endurance athletes, got to the point they were simply talking about duration all the time, or volume, which you've talked about, how many hours you did per week or miles or kilometers, whatever it may be. And so that had become overwhelming. Everybody's just talking about volume all the time as if intensity didn't exist. Yet everybody in the world of research, sports research, understood that intensity was really a very important key ingredient to how well an athlete's performance comes along in training. But there's no way to discuss it. This guy, his name was Bannister, by the way, not Roger Bannister, just happens to have the same name. Bannister comes up with this idea back then in which you could essentially combine intensity and duration into one number, and you would have this number you could give to a workout, and that number would describe how hard the workout was in terms of both things. So it wasn't just one or the other, it was a combination. And that idea never really took off, but it was interesting. Most sports scientists were very aware of it. One of those sports scientists was a guy, this Andy Coggan I mentioned a while ago. Coggan happened to also be a road cyclist. By the early 2000s, he was developing this idea that you could do something called the Churning Stress Score, which was essentially using a power meter to give you something like TRIMP. It was a combination of power and duration, intensity and duration, all tied into one number to express how hard a workout was. And then you could look at that in terms of volume, how much TSS you did in a week, for example. And basically we could start moving into these topics that we mentioned earlier, which is chronic churning load, acute churning load, and churning stress balance. Chronic churning load, or CTL, being his way of expressing when you looked at the cumulative TSS over a long period of time, and by a long period of time, he's talking in the neighborhood of 6 weeks. If you look at how much TSS was accumulated in 6 weeks, he called that the chronic churning load. Chronic meaning the long period of time. So what was your average per day, for example, for a 6 week period of time? And that was the CTL, which basically was a way of expressing fitness. How fit are you? Because the more churning load you do, the more fit you become. We all know that. That's why we train. Yep. And so as the churning load increases, our fitness increases. But we also know that as the churning load increases, our fatigue increases. We become tired. And so he began to look at that in terms of a shorter duration of period of time. Since fitness happens over a long period of time, it takes roughly 6 weeks to be able to measure a change in fitness. But fatigue you can feel almost immediately. The next day you know you're tired. You don't know you're more fit, but you know you're tired. And so he used a much smaller number. In this case, it was 7. So he was looking at what was your average TSS per day for a 7-day period. And that he called the acute churning load, or short period of time, acute meaning short. So we had CTL and ATL. And then somebody else came along with the idea that this was not Coggan or Hunter Allen. A third party came up with the idea that if we subtracted these two, if we took the CTL for a given day, subtracted one's ATL for that day, in other words, took their cumulative average training load, TSS, per day for 42-day period of time. Take that per day and subtract the acute churning load, the 7-day average, from the CTL. You get something that would express something which is on the same category as form, which is how ready are you to race. In other words, you aren't ready to race if your fatigue is too high or your fitness is too low. And so this number now gave us a way of talking about the form the athlete is in, this TSB idea. We have fitness, fatigue, and form, which are the three things that athletes have always talked about, but now with a power meter or a heart rate monitor now today, and other devices too, one can now begin to monitor fitness, fatigue, and form by looking at numbers. And so this performance management chart that you mentioned, Brad, is really the way of expressing that in a chart. It kind of simplifies the whole concept. And I realize if somebody has not used a power meter, has never done this TSS stuff, this just sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, I'm sure. It's overwhelming, the data you can look at. And all we're doing is taking the numbers off your power meter or your heart rate monitor, and from that drawing conclusions about what your fitness is and how tired you are, and what your readiness is to race. So it's just an amazing tool.
It simplifies things, as you say there, Joe. If you're not initiated with it, it can sound overwhelming, but it really isn't. It's all pictorial, really. Just look at the pink, blue, and yellow numbers, and you'll begin to understand how they apply to your own training and racing performance and preparations. And I think the essence of it, Joe, is, and I really appreciate it from my work as a sports physio who consults with injured endurance athletes, runners, triathletes, and there's I think Training Peaks has had a large part to play with this. There's an appreciation that, yes, like you said, training isn't just volume, it's the intensity equation as well that so matters. Joe, with the number though, the form, the training stress balance, what can you paint it's obviously individual, highly individual. You've coached the top of endurance sports through to age groupers, beginners over the 40 years you were coaching for. What are some of the things just to know practically about the numbers? Where do you like to see them, and how might you guide someone with those? I know it's a huge question.
It is. What typically the first thing you would look for is what's happening to the athlete's fitness, which is obvious. We're always wondering that as coaches and athletes, what's happening to our fitness? Is it increasing? This chart shows you whether it is or not. Obviously, it's not perfect. We're not really looking at fitness. We're just simply looking at how much training load you're doing is all we're doing. And we're drawing conclusions from that, which are typically well-founded, but certainly not perfect. We'll have better systems come out of this whole thing, I'm sure, over the years to come. But for right now, it's the best we have, I think. And so it gives you some idea of what the athlete's fitness is. And then the other thing I'm most interested in looking at is their form. That gives me a great idea of where we are, what we should be doing. It tells us if the athlete is training too hard or not training hard enough or is training optimally. So I can draw very nice conclusions by looking at this chart and just looking at those two things. In fact, if all I really know are those two things, I can tell you an awful lot about the athlete's readiness to perform in a race just by knowing what those numbers are, especially looking at what the trend has been for those numbers over some period of time, like the last 6 weeks. So it's just really an amazing tool, but it is quite, it's at first it's very confusing to look at, and you have to kind of play with it for a while, but after you get onto it, it really starts to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And come race day, what range might you want to see someone in numerically for their form, Joe? I know it's individual. Yeah, form becomes the critical variable we're looking at on race day. What I like to see, and this varies quite widely, the numbers, realize again, we're talking about numbers here that are based on taking these TSS per days and coming up with what your average TSS per day is for 40-day to 42-day period, and doing the same thing for 7-day period and subtracting these, and you have something that's this TSB, training stress balance or form. So the numbers you're already pretty deep into this whole concept by the time we get to this point, but the TSB can wind up being either negative or positive, because if we're taking CTL minus ATL,
if ATL is a higher number than CTL, you wind up with a negative TSB. So we could have numbers which are highly negative. That means the athlete is not on form at all. In fact, they may be fairly far from form at this point, but that's normal. We need to have that happen. The athlete needs to lose form quite frequently and for quite long periods of time in order to build fitness. And so consequently, once we start getting close to a race, I want to see those things begin to reverse. I want to see form begin to rise from a negative number to becoming a positive number, which means the fitness is greater than fatigue. CTL is a greater number than ATL is if TSB is positive. And this is all starting to remind me of my calculus teacher when I was in college. I scratched my head. My head when he was talking.
Lucky there's training.
But this is
to simplify it, Joe.
Yeah, this isn't quite that complicated. But if you're brand new to it, I know it sounds like really fairly complex here. But I want the TSB to become a positive number, which means fatigue or fitness is now greater than fatigue, which is what you want to happen as you're coming to race day. You want fatigue to be very, very low, having gone away. So when you come to the race, you're not tired at all. So that's fatigue. So we're trying to get that down as low as we can, and we're trying to maintain fitness as high as we can, although the athlete is going to lose some fitness. Whenever you cut back on training, you lose fitness. That's what peaking is all about. When you taper, you lose fitness. And athletes never like to hear that. They always think somehow they're gaining fitness, but they're not. They're not gaining fitness, they're gaining form. Form means the absence of fatigue and a new status which might be called fresh. The athlete is fresh and ready to race. And so they go to the starting line and they can have a good race. And what I like to see for that is a number which is someplace between +5 and +25 for the athlete on race day. That's a fairly wide-ranging number. Most athletes I found 15 to 25 is a better range for most athletes that I've coached anyway, given my method of coaching. But I've also found some athletes I've coached that don't do well when they're that well rested. +15 to +25 means the athlete comes into race day well rested. And I've often had athletes in the early days when I was doing this telling me they just felt flat on race morning. They just didn't feel like they were ready for it. They would do it, and they may have a decent race, but they just never felt like it was quite what they could have done. And so after a lot of head scratching, I decided to toy around with these athletes and try having them come to race day with a lower TSB instead of being +15 or +10 to +25 or in that range anyway, more like +5 to +15 or +10 even. And I discovered some of those athletes felt better on race day. They didn't tell me they felt flat anymore. They felt like they were ready to race. And I don't know if it's physiological or psychological or what's going on, but I realize that athletes come to race day with different status based on something which I don't fully understand, but I can certainly plan for it once I know what works better for them. So it's the sort of thing the coach needs to figure out. And those numbers I'm giving, +5 to +25, those work for me, given my way of training athletes and my way of tapering athletes and all that sort of thing. There's nothing that says this is the way you have to do it. Every coach, every athlete needs to kind of figure this out for themselves. My numbers may be a starting place, but they may come up with something entirely different. So it's wide open for experimentation.
And hence the art and science of coaching and the endless pursuit for both athletes and coaches in exploring that potential best performance. I really like what you said there, Joe. When you taper, it's not gaining fitness, it's gaining form. And it made me think of Australian distance running coach Dick Telford, who describes that as removing the cloud of fatigue from the athlete. I thought that was quite a nice sentiment. And
he's exactly right.
Yeah, but simple, isn't it? And Joe, I think one thing that certainly as an athlete over 25 years of endurance sports, it's easy to forget is that, as Shona Halson, former recovery scientist at the Australian Institute of Sport, states the only training that an athlete is benefiting from is the training that they're recovering from. Hence that form number is so important, right? Sounds so simple.
You bet.
Brilliant.
It is. I put together a blog on this some time back. It's on my blog still. And basically it teaches the athlete how to look at TSB or form on a regular basis, as in daily, and see how they're doing. Without looking at anything else, without looking at their fitness, without looking at their fatigue, if they just look at that one number every day, that number tells you if you're training too hard and therefore need more rest. It'll tell you if you're training optimally and just keep on doing what you're doing. It'll tell you if you're resting too much, you're not really training enough. And so from one number, we can draw a lot of conclusions. So I wrote about this in my blog to kind of help athletes understand how to use this chart.
You're listening to Joe Friel, founder of Training Peaks, prolific endurance sports author, on This and Expert Edition. If you missed last week's episode featuring dual Olympic medalist and former World Triathlon Series champion Johnny Brownlee, here's a little snippet of what you missed.
I still think the hardest sessions I do are the Thursday evening chain gangs. So with cycling, it's awful because obviously you've got someone next to you. We go to a local chain gang on a Thursday. It starts at 6:30. Somewhere between 50 people, 20 and 50 people can meet. Anyone from my brother Tom Pidcock, who was a medalist at the World Cyclocross Champs this year, unbelievable athlete, to the local gardener, turn up. People come back from work, and the strongest of them all is a local gardener who turns up and just makes you suffer. It finishes up a hill, and I've never been through so much pain going, there's no way that the local gardener is dropping me up this climb.
Be sure to jump back if you missed Johnny Brownlee's sharings and tune into episode 217 and part 1 of the doubleheader, episode 216, with Johnny Brownlee's highs, lows and career learnings. And boy oh boy has there been some great feedback about Johnny's sharings. For now, let's jump back with Joe Friel on this expert edition, exploring all things endurance training principles. Joe, shifting gears to some of the learnings here, what would you say are the top 3 mistakes from your incredible experience over your decades in the industry? As a coach that has, even to this day, continued to stay at the forefront of research, you've been curious your whole career. What are the top 3 mistakes? It's a broad question you see endurance athletes making.
Yeah, it's kind of the same things that have been the same things as long as I've been in sport. Number one, I see athletes training too much. And that doesn't necessarily mean how many days per week or how many workouts they do or how many hours, but everything has always got to be more. And that's the biggest mistake they make. For example, when I would coach somebody and write their programs for them for the first few weeks, I would quite often, and this is a very common comment I got from them, was after a few weeks, they would tell me they're doing a lot less training now than they were before when they were self-coached. And yet, almost invariably, these athletes would race better. I was pretty good at getting them to the starting line ready to have a good race, even though they were doing less training, less volume is what they were looking at. How much volume are they doing? They were doing less volume than they were before. They were doing extremely well as far as performance. For example, I had one athlete who was a pro triathlete. This is back late 90s, early 2000s. And he was churning to make the Olympic team, the U.S. Olympic team for the 2000 games in Sydney. He made the team eventually for the U.S., but he kept winding up with upper respiratory infections, which was really setting us back. And so finally, I cut his churning way back. I cut him back to like 17, 18 hours a week of churning, whereas other pros, at least in those days, were churning more like 30 hours a week who were getting ready for the Olympics. And so I cut him back to really a handful of hours, but we made sure everything he did had a purpose and was focused on qualifying. And he did qualify and had a great race that day. And I just couldn't churn him the way that most of the pros were doing it, but he still did extremely well. So that's number one. The biggest mistake most athletes make is they just do too much. I don't care what we talk about. It's always too much. I can get athletes to perform much better if we just get smarter. If we do the right things, it's just doing a bunch of stuff, they'll do much better. The second thing kind of fits in with that one. They just don't take enough rest. Their easy days are not easy enough. Their easy days are too hard. Trying to get an athlete to go easy is one of the hardest things there is in the world of coaching. That's about the biggest challenge there is. The athlete always wants to go a little bit harder than they should. I ride with athletes here where I live from time to time, and I found it's impossible to do an easy ride with a group of athletes or even one more athlete. They just can't go easy. They don't know what that word means, really. So it's just a real challenge that athletes just don't take enough rest. They don't make their easy days easy enough. They try to make their easy days moderately hard, and that means that their hard workouts become moderately hard. So nothing becomes really hard anymore. Everything kind of moves toward the middle, and you don't make much progress when everything's in the middle. You have to be doing either hard workouts or easy workouts, trying to avoid all the stuff in the middle, which is this thing we've been talking about now for more than 15 years, this polarization of training. Stephen Seiler came up with back in the early 2000s. That's what we all need to be doing, but I can't get, athletes just don't want to do that. They do not want to go easy. And the third thing is they don't get enough sleep. This is one of the biggest challenges I've run into in coaching athletes was they just don't get enough sleep. I would get athletes coming to me always who had very high goals. I never got an athlete coming to me saying that their goal was to finish a local 5K. I never got that athlete. I always got the athlete who wanted to qualify for Kona, who wanted to be on this podium at a national championship, who wanted to achieve these tremendous, very high goals. And so the first thing, knowing this was going to be extremely difficult for them to do, was I had to get into how much sleep are they getting, because that's really key. It really wasn't so much their training, it's how much sleep they get is the big issue. Because when you sleep, that's when these anabolic hormones are released into your body, these tissue building hormones. So all the workout does is give you the potential for fitness. The workout doesn't give you fitness. It only creates potential for fitness. The potential is realized during sleep. And so if the athlete's not getting enough sleep, which I found is extremely common among everybody in the U.S., I'm sure in Australia also, probably in the Western Hemisphere, I'm positive of that too, go to Europe or wherever, we would find the same thing, that people are just not getting enough sleep. Athletes they've packed too much into their days. The typical triathlete has got a pool session, a master's swim at 5 o'clock in the morning or 5:30, something like that. And so they got to get up at 4:30 in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning to make it to that. And then they work all day. You get home at night, spend time with the family, and the next thing you know, after watching TV and so forth, checking email, it's 11 o'clock, and they go to bed, and they got to get up the next morning at 4. So they get 5 hours of sleep. And so what have they done? They just shortchanged their fitness. They've just taken away the value of the workouts they did that day is greatly reduced. So that was always my biggest challenge. And so I would tell the athletes, and I've said this so many times, I'm sure that people who are listening have already heard me say this once before. I would tell my athletes who had these extremely high goals that they could have only 3 things in their life. They could have their family, they could have their career, and they could have training. They cannot become members of their local homeowners association. They cannot volunteer to work for a nonprofit organization. They can't take up playing golf. There's all these sorts of things they can't do. Their neighbors may be doing and having a great deal of fun with. But if you're trying to qualify for Kona, you're trying to get on the podium in a national championship, you can't do all those things. We got to get sleep. And what everybody does is when they add something to their life, which just takes time, where that time comes from is sleep. So they cut out an hour or 2 hours of sleep so they could fit in one more thing in their day. And so that I found was actually the key to helping athletes achieve their goals, was to make sure they simply got enough sleep. So that's the 3 things I would suggest are the big 3 from my coaching experience.
Joe, that is so rich, and it makes me think of who you just referenced, Dr. Stephen Seiler, who, just like yourself, has appeared on the show as an expert addition, and he says, keep it simple, scientists, and I think they are beautiful. 1, big mistake, training too much. 2, not taking enough rest or getting enough rest, going too hard on the easy days. And 3, neglecting to get enough sleep. And it makes me think, Joe, of current World Triathlon Series champion Vincent Lewis, who on this show mentioned that prior to joining his coach, Joel Friel, used to run, for example, 160 kilometres a week. And when he joined Joel's squad, Joel said, no, you don't need to do 160, Vincent. Let's stick with 100. And he has had some of the best form he's had in his whole career since he's dropped off the volume.
Right. Yep. I think most athletes who are addicted to the sport could do that and perform better.
So interesting. Joe, if you could boil everything you've learnt through your career into one piece of advice, this is the most difficult question someone could ask of a gentleman like yourself, to help listeners of this show perform at their physical best, what would that one piece of advice be, Joe, if you could only issue one bit of advice?
For me, it would be to stay hungry, to always be wanting to learn, for example, to be curious, to ask questions, not assume you already have the answer. Just stay hungry all the time. Always looking for better ways and better equipment, better thoughts, better everything, because you're staying hungry.
What's driven your hungriness? Joe, you still love it. Before recording today, you did a few hours on the trainer there with your wife, Joyce.
Well, we were actually outdoors. We have pretty nice weather here.
Sorry, outdoors.
Yeah, we got a couple hours. Got a couple hours in on the road, and do that every day. And it's just like people ask me that, or my friends who are not into sport, they'll ask me that question: how often do you ride your bike, or how many miles, or how many hours, or how many kilometers, whatever it may be. And when I tell them, they always have this astonished look on their face that gosh, how can you possibly do that? And I see it as kind of like brushing my teeth. I don't think about how many hours it takes to brush my teeth a week, or should I do it or not. I just go brush my teeth. It's just something I've been doing my entire life, and it's just me. So it doesn't really cross my mind that, am I going to ride my bike today or not? Am I going to work out or not? I just know it's something I'm going to do, and I just go do it.
And as a masters athlete, I think you're a great example of lifelong fitness and learning. You've written Fast After 50. Would there be a single piece of advice you'd give to the masters athlete specifically, Joe?
Yeah, masters athletes. The first thing you discover about masters athletes is they need more frequent recovery days, because they don't recover as quickly as they did when they were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. By the time you're in your 50s, you begin to notice that it's just taking a little bit longer to recover between hard workouts. I can recall when I was in college running on the track team, our coach only knew one workout. It was the same workout every day. It was what I called intervals till you puke, because every day somebody's going to throw up every day. And so consequently, we'd just go out there and we'd run intervals till we puke every day. And we never had any idea of how long the interval was, how fast we're supposed to run the interval, or how many we're going to do, or what the duration of rest between intervals was going to be. It was whatever the coach felt like that day. So we were always blind about the workout. And, so it was just a complete, so what you did was you tried to hold back so that you didn't, because it's all you're going to run. It's going to be 400s that day. For all you knew, you were going to do 25 400s. You had no idea it was coming up, or it's going to be 10. You just didn't know. And so you had to hold back and make sure you didn't waste any energy. And so I began to learn at an early age that was not a good way to train. It was about the worst way there was possible to train. So that led me to this whole thing of asking questions about what's the better way of doing this, and kind of took me down the path to what I'm doing today.
Yeah, wow. So much there. And finally, Joe, every guest of the show issues listeners of this show with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Joe Friel's physical challenge for the week going to be to listeners?
My physical challenge would be to follow every hard day with a very easy day. And very easy, meaning you're in zone 1 heart rate, for example. And I would suggest that most athletes can't do that. They cannot go out and do a zone 1 workout. They feel it's a waste of their time, but they would be amazed if they started doing that, how much better their hard workouts became.
That's very practical. Follow every hard day with an easy day, Joe.
Right, yep.
Joe Friel, I don't know if you're at liberty to share it, but what can we expect from you next? What's this next book you're going to output, or you probably can't say?
No, I can say the book I'm just about done with is called Ride Inside. It's about indoor training. I realized, and this is too late when I realized this, I realized last fall that things like Zwift and all the trainers we have available to us now, these smart trainers, there was nothing available on all this stuff. There was no books out there about how to use all this. And so I made it a challenge myself to write a book on that topic. I've got a co-author, Jim Rutberg, is quite an authority on the subject, a good cyclist himself, a coach. And so together we are just finishing off the book right now. And then when I get that done, I'm working on another book with another potential co-author whose name is, probably shouldn't say his name yet since it's not really a done project yet. But my next book, I want to be a book for coaches. Right. I've been thinking about writing this book for, 10 or 15 years, and I think it's finally time to write a book for coaches on how to be a better coach.
And I mean, you are known as the coach of coaches, so that'll be a fantastic publication. And there was a question that did come through, Joe, from Joe Coombe, who stated, I used Joe's training Bible to do my first self-coach Ironman in 2010. Yes, I'm the epitome of a triathlon geek. Given the large number of people riding on Zwift due to coronavirus, does Joe have any suggested alterations on how we would normally plan an Ironman during this period with riding indoors more? Maybe the answer's get the book when it comes out.
Yeah, I wrote the book so that both road cyclists and triathletes could have something they could take away as an indoor training advice. And hopefully we accomplish that. But right now, since we're all kind of like, or many at least are, stuck indoors, I'm not where I live. I can still ride outdoors. But many are training indoors. And it's really too bad I didn't think of this idea earlier, because the book is going to come out probably the end of the summer. And who knows what situation we'll be in then. Hopefully it'll be better than our situation now. But anyway, the key thing is to make sure the base fitness is really well established. I suspect every athlete who's listening right now has had their race either postponed or canceled for this season. And so the most important thing they could do right now is go back to base training, make sure they've just got a really well-established base of fitness. And if they're not sure exactly what that means, they can check one of my training Bibles where I talk about base training considerably. And this new book, this Ride Inside, it's called, will also talk about base training and how to do that indoors. But that would be the key right now, I think, for most all athletes, is make sure their base fitness is really well established.
Joe, that's so practical and timely, so thank you. Joe, as a lover of endurance sports myself, 25 years plus being around the world, thank you for your contribution to me personally, but also the greater good. You are a great example of lifelong learning and application. And thank you for your contribution to the show today.
Thank you very much, Brad. I enjoyed it. It's always fun.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed and were informed from Joe Friel's sharings today. If you did enjoy the episode, then feel free to take a podsy and tag in the show at Physical Performance Show, my handle at Brad_beer. We love to know that the episode has landed and what it was that you took away from the learnings. Massive thanks to those hitting subscribe over on your designated podcast player. Subscribing to the show is the best way to help it grow. And if you've enjoyed more than 4 episodes, then please go ahead and subscribe today. Another huge thanks to those leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes. I'll read out some of the recent reviews on upcoming episodes. As always, a huge thanks to the 3 very good folk who make this show possible each week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Of course, podcasts are not free to produce, they are free to consume, so we appreciate Kinesis Sunscreen, support of the show, and don't forget to take advantage of their offer, 20% off the entire performance sunscreen range by using the coupon code POGO online. If you are yet to register for the Dr. Stephen Seiler upcoming live stream to be held on July the 18th. It's a 3-hour live stream with a post-live stream recording included and a workbook for the ticketed price of just $49. Then jump over today, pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler livestream, and get ready to learn from a true pioneer in endurance sports sciences. You heard Joe Friel, the coach of coaches for triathlon, mentioned Dr. Stephen Seiler on this episode, so you are not going to want to miss the opportunity to hear from Dr. Seiler on the live stream, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. Dr. Seiler actually had a TED Talk recently. It's gone viral. I believe it's had more than 500,000 downloads in just several months, where he challenges the long-held belief that no pain equals no gain when it comes to physical output. So jump over and do check out Dr. Seiler's viral TED Talk. Just search Dr. Seiler TED Talk from within YouTube. Now, some great news. In keeping this theme of endurance training optimization going, we have Dr. Stephen Seiler back next week for a return visit on the Physical Performance Show. Dr. Seiler last appeared on episode 172, and to date that has been the most downloaded episode of the show. And on next week's Expert Edition, Dr. Seiler explores training through COVID, pitfalls to avoid, and how to get the most out of this uncertain period. He shares around marathon pacing and what hitting the wall actually means. And we wrestle the question to the ground, does everybody hit the wall in a marathon?
What we have seen in both in controlled studies, but also just lots of feedback over the years now, is that yes, when recreational age groupers training 6 hours a week, when they get control of their intensity distribution, when they quit chasing squirrels, they report back so often and say, you know what, this works. I run slower on some of the days than I ever have before, but I'm also running faster on some of the days than I ever have before, and I've set new PRs.
That plus so much more from Dr. Stephen Seiler on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show. All right, until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.